Hello everyone and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. Next week, Britain could abolish itself. On September 18th, Scotland will hold a major referendum. Voters will be asked this question: should Scotland be an independent country? The British government in London has promised to honor the outcome of the referendum. Basically, that means that if a majority of Scots vote yes next Thursday, the British government will renounce its sovereignty over Scotland. And that essentially means that Britain will be renouncing Britain. Great Britain formally joined together in the year 1707. That was when the parliaments of Scotland and England ratified the Act of Union, and England and Scotland became Great Britain. The reason Britain has existed for the past 300 years is because Scotland is not an independent country. If Scotland secedes, the United Kingdom will be pared down to just England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. But without Scotland, there really is no Britain. Think about that. After 3 centuries of history, no Britain. And not just any history. The history of Great Britain is literally one of the greatest of all time. And now it's debating whether to dismember itself.
This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world.
And he said unto me, you must prophesy again.
Richard Halloran at Political Magazine wrote an article recently titled "The Sad, Dark End of the British Empire." He wrote that on August 26th, 2014. And in it, he listed off some of the stats about the British Empire. We've talked to you about these stats before. A lot of them are discussed in the United States and Britain in prophecy. But in this political article, he says that Britain ruled 57 colonies. This is at its peak. 57 colonies, dominions, territories, and protectorates. It ruled the continent of Australia, the subcontinent of India. It ruled all or parts of dozens of other countries: Ireland, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Fiji, New Zealand, the Caribbean, Central America, Canada, even America. And the list just goes on and on. This was Great Britain. It was the greatest empire in history, greater than Rome, larger than Rome, better than Rome. It was the largest empire in history, and for an empire, it was the most just and lawful empire in history. Many people don't want to admit that today, but it was. It brought order and peace and health and wealth to people all over the world. As the saying went, the sun never did set on the British Empire. And that was literally true. If the sun was setting in Greenwich or Victoria, it was already rising in Wellington or Bombay. That article that I mentioned there cites Stephen Lunscombe, who calculates that London governed about 20% of the population of the entire world, that it ruled a quarter of the landmass around the globe. That's incredible to think about how far-reaching this empire really was. And now here we are in 2014, and we're talking about Britain not losing a large landmass halfway around the world, but losing the landmass right next door, right on its own island, Scotland. Halloran says that the Scottish voters hold the key to the final dissolution of one of the greatest empires in history. He said, today, sundown is at hand. Now, where have you heard this before? Who's talked about the end of the empire? It's discussed at length here in the United States and Britain in prophecy. It's prophesied. what we're seeing happen. Now, that doesn't mean we know exactly what will happen with a referendum next week, but it certainly does indicate just how far the British Empire has fallen, that this topic is even under discussion, that the British people, that the Scots would be considering dismembering Britain. Let me take you to a quote from that Politico piece, The Sad Dark End of the British Empire. It says, "Today that empire has been reduced to 14 scattered islands, such as the British Virgin Islands in the Caribbean and Pitcairn Island in the South Pacific. The Commonwealth of Nations, founded before World War II and revived after the war, comprises 54 former British territories, but is little more than a monument to the empire." It says, "Now the wave of dissolution is lapping up against the shores of the British Isles themselves. Now it's pushing right up to the islands themselves as Scotland considers secession." And that would just be like the final punctuation mark on this long and ignoble disintegration of an empire that's discussed in the book of Genesis, in your Bible. This company of nations that Britain became. Now, as I said, we don't know how the vote will go, but in just looking at what's happened over the last 4 or 5 weeks, I mean, just here recently, a week or so, it was reported that now 51% of the Scots are in favor of secession. And not that long ago, the number was down around 39%. It appears to be gaining momentum, so much so that the Queen is in a panic. And Mr. Cameron as well, as they're going around now here at the last moment, the last week, trying to save Britain, trying to keep Scotland from declaring its independence. Even a month ago, certainly if you go back a year or two ago, this would have seemed so far-fetched. And now here it is as a distinct possibility. Even if it doesn't happen, it certainly reveals a lot about the state of Britain today. This is from the Spectator article. You can see the title there. "Without Scotland, England would be a weedy laughingstock." This is from a few weeks ago. It says, "If Scotland votes to leave the United Kingdom, it would be Britain's greatest ever defeat. The nation would have voted to abolish itself." That's what they're considering right now in Britain, whether or not to abolish itself. He goes on and talks about how it would become a global laughingstock if the yes vote wins. And he said, just think about a British Prime Minister in the future trying to raise his voice in the global arena, and the response back that he would get, I mean, from other nations that would say, well, who are you to speak up? You can't even keep your own country together. What a sad end. It says, "Scotland is not a colony speaking a separate language. The Scottish people are not discriminated against within the Union. Indeed, the last Prime Minister and Chancellor were both Scots." I mean, there's no reason, really, for this to even be considered. But I guess because the Conservative Party in Scotland is so unpopular, the independence parties are gaining momentum. Mr. Palmer, Richard Palmer, had a great article at thetrumpet.com earlier this week about how for many people in Scotland it just boils down to government handouts. Well, what are the independence parties declaring or promising as opposed to what they're promising down in London? How many more handouts can we get? That's where we are today for the British people. Not unlike the way it is here in America, with so many in the general population just looking for what they can get from a government, any government, a new government, an independent government. Mr. Palmer goes through that at length in his article. Go back and look at that. He titled it, "The End of Britain is Nigh." It's upon us. Boris Johnson wrote an article at The Telegraph recently as well. You can see his title and what he thinks about this referendum. "Decapitate Britain and we will kill off the greatest political union ever. The greatest political union ever, he says. Mr. Johnson's one of the more popular politicians in London. He's the mayor of London currently. Notice what he said. Take Scotland away from England and you are losing a critical part of our political nomenclature. There was no British government before the union with Scotland. There was no British electorate. There were no British interests. There was England and Wales, and there was Scotland. Take away Scotland and we destroy Britain. You take away Scotland and we destroy Britain. Think about that. And yet, as he brings out in this piece, a lot of people don't really seem to care about that. Notice what he says later. I'm frankly appalled by the complacency and apathy of so many of my non-political friends, people who haven't focused at all on the debate and think that we can afford to let the Scots go because A, we subsidize them, and B, they have so many Labour MPs. Let's get rid of them. Who needs them? And then the Scots are up there thinking, well, let's pull away. Maybe we can get a better deal with the government that's independent. And as he brings out, I mean, he's just startled at how complacent people are. We've talked a lot about complacency in recent programs. Complacency about what's happening in the world. Complacency on this subject, with so many people just taking a, kind of a nonchalant approach. Well, who cares? Let them do what they want. Scotland leaves. I mean, the flag could have to change, of course, all the symbols on passports and money and things of that nature. But there's serious consequences, too, like with respect to the nukes. This individual at the Telegraph, Vice Admiral John McAnally, wrote at the Telegraph that if a yes vote goes through, it could force Britain to abandon its nuclear weapons because they're stationed in Scotland. I mean, think about that. That's not something to be complacent about. Britain's the third largest nuclear power in the world, and that arsenal of Trident nuclear missiles is located in Scotland, as I say, and the Scottish National Party has promised that if it wins the independence vote, that it will dismantle or transfer those nukes. Now, Mr. Palmer brings out in his article that maybe the language is worded just so that they could reach some agreement, even if they declare their independence, to still keep those nukes, but still, that all of this nuclear weapon arsenal is sort of up in the air right now. That's astounding to think about the impact that this could have. Bloomberg reported recently about what the British government has said about this, going back to last January, I think it was. It says, we are confident that the people of Scotland will choose to remain part of the UK and are not planning for Scottish independence or to move the strategic nuclear deterrent. That's sort of been the casual sounding response from the British government for many, many months now. But now, I mean, basically they've said, well, the Scots aren't going to declare independence. Let's not even really talk about it. Now, in recent weeks, it's looking like it's going to be a tight race. It's looking like it's going to be a close call. Here you have a case where even the government's been complacent, thinking that, well, that couldn't happen, and maybe it won't. But still, is this something to be complacent about? James McKeon, he's wrote this article, Scottish Independence Could Leave UK Nuclear Weapons Homeless. He writes, the UK government and Ministry of Defence have repeatedly argued that they believe Scots will vote against independence, and thus Britain is not preparing for the possibility of Scottish disarmament. That last part, notice that. Britain is not preparing. It's, as he says, it's kind of a political thing. Well, we know we'll stay together, so let's not even think about it. But what if it does happen? And why wouldn't you prepare for it? Well, maybe there are plans in place that we don't read as much about. Some have written about the possibility of moving that arsenal to a base in Georgia here in the United States that is shared between the United States and Britain. But if something like that were to happen, it would be incredibly costly, for one. Some estimating about $100 billion just to move these warheads. And then, of course, having them here, as the BBC points out, no country has ever kept their deterrent force in its entirety in a foreign country based on the principle that a country's last resort has to be somewhere where it has total control of it. I mean, no country has created this kind of an arsenal and then just shipped it to another country and says, here, you take care of it. That pretty much removes the deterrent. Are we moving in the direction of Britain just completely dismantling its program? It's a strong deterrent for enemies that are, as we see, rising all over the world. And Britain has long since forsaken God. They don't trust in God for their protection. That puts them in a very vulnerable position if then they lose trust in these weapons. Let me read to you what The Guardian said recently. Last October, Westminster's Scottish Affairs Committee report said that Trident could be disarmed within days and removed within months. Former UN Weapons Inspector Hans Blix has urged the UK government to scrap Trident. It may well be that most people in the rest of the UK would regard Scottish independence as an opportunity to follow Mr. Blix's wise advice and get rid of nuclear weapons altogether, saving $100 billion in the process. I mean, that's from the left-wing Guardian. And I'm sure many people in England support that kind of view. But look at how far the United Kingdom, look at how far Great Britain has fallen. I mean, some of the things being discussed, some of the things debated today, they reveal whether or not the vote goes one way or the other. They certainly reveal just how, you could say, how ungreat Britain is today. Winston Churchill, as we've said before, called them Little Englanders, those that didn't want to see the empire expand and spread. Talk about Little England. If the Scots decide to leave, that's what you're left with. Let me give you a quote from Mr. Palmer's article. This was at the Trumpet. As I said earlier in the week, he says, "It would be the end of Britain as a first-rate military power. For good or for evil, the UK would no longer be able to intervene in world events in any meaningful way. At the same time, it would destroy Britain's soft power. As Trumpet editor-in-chief Stephen Flurry pointed out on a recent Key of David program, England would be incapable of telling other countries how to run their affairs when it couldn't even keep its own country together." That's what's at stake here. What a loss of power and prestige, of influence. That's what the people of Britain are considering this next week. Let's look at Hosea 2, just a couple of verses here before we conclude. A lot of people, of course, look at all of these events swirling in Britain, in England, in Scotland, all around the world, and they assume that, well, the Bible doesn't really have anything to say about it. And they assume wrong. I mean, they're wrong on that. The Bible has so much to say about what's happening in your world today, and even what's happening in Britain. It certainly does. We may not know exactly how the referendum will go, but we certainly know the direction that the British Empire is going in. And Mr. Armstrong, decades ago, talked about Britain being the sick man of Europe and how that Britain needed to wake up. He talked about it in the 1970s, Britain giving up the empire. This is Hosea 2, and verse 8 says, "For she did not know that I gave her corn and wine and oil and multiplied her silver and gold, which they prepared for Baal," as I read recently on this. All this power, this wealth, I mean, controlling 20% of the earth's population, a fourth of the landmass on this earth. All of that was gifted to the British people because of promises made to Abraham. Going back to the very book, the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. Verse 9, he says, "Therefore will I return and take away my corn in the time thereof, and my wine in the season thereof, and I will recover my wool and my flax given to cover her nakedness. And now will I discover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and none shall deliver her out of my hand. It's amazing how many feel safe enough to say, let's just get rid of our nuclear deterrent and place our faith and our trust in nations that historically have been great enemies of ours. That's what we see happening. You can look in other prophecies, Hosea 5 and elsewhere, that discuss this. We won't take the time to go there now, but suffice it to say, the British people need to wake up to what's happening. They can't be complacent about what's happening in their nation. As I said, Mr. Armstrong said decades ago that they were going to lose their beloved empire. And that has certainly happened. I mean, the reality of this is undeniable. Make sure you go and read that article by Mr. Palmer at thetrumpet.com, The End of Britain is Nigh. And then, of course, there's this book, The United States and Britain in Prophecy. It's a much longer study, but an important one, a critical one, for you to understand the world that you live in today and to understand what God says about the United States and Britain, what God has prophesied. This book goes back and from the beginning and goes into those prophecies in Genesis that I spoke of and shows how and why God blessed the people of Britain, why God blessed the British Empire. You can read all about that in this text written by Herbert Armstrong way back at the earlier part of the 20th century. You can follow the blessings, the identity. You can follow it right up through to today and then understand why those blessings are being taken away. It's one of the most important and relevant and very current books that you could study of anything that we send out or produce. Make sure, if you don't have your own copy, to go to the website and start reading today, or go to the phone and call one of our operators, and we'll send you a hard copy of this book, just like this, free of charge, no cost or obligation to you. We want you to have it. More than that, we want you to dig in and to study it. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on the Trumpet Daily.